Question 2. Can you talk to us about the corporate trust trend and the private politics concept? And before you answer that, I have another quote from your book, which I enjoy. When it comes to reputation, many companies face a mismatch between assets and capabilities. Reputation is widely considered a core asset, and its protection is near the top of a CEO's agenda. Yet most companies have woefully inadequate reputation management strategies and process. The result is one reputation crisis after another. Can you talk to the trust trend that you see in that table that you provided, and the private politics concept is very fascinating to me.
Yeah, so the way you want to think about this is that over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, we have seen reputational risk for large globally operating companies increasing, while the reputation management capability has essentially stayed the same. So there haven't been any dramatic changes on that, but the risk has increased. Now, what are the drivers of that risk? And the drivers are, number one, is a growing media environment. We're all aware of that. From 24-hour news channels to social media, that just means companies are more in the spotlight. Number two is a change in values or in expectations. So we now have very high expectations of companies, and when we talked a little bit before over issues like even things like business continuity or security, there's just kind of an expectations that companies invest in that and are ready for these types of things. And if they're not, they get hammered. And there is another dimension to that has these kind of social dimensions, sustainability, diversity, labor standards. It's just not enough anymore to stay within the law and to make money, but we have these high expectations of companies. And if we don't satisfy them as a company, we're in trouble. That's the second piece. And the third piece is this private politics dimensions that you mentioned before. That's really an unintended consequence of operating in a global environment. So take the Bangladesh factory example, where we had basically a complete breakdown of building safety standards in a market such as Bangladesh. And so the government didn't do its job, so to speak. But then what happened is that NGOs and advocacy groups basically looked to globally operating businesses to fill the gap. And so now you have retailers such as H&M and a whole bunch of predominantly European retailers saying, you know what, we're going to subscribe to these safety standards for operating in Bangladesh. But what that means basically is that we are now fulfilling the same role effectively as a political or regulatory organizations would be. And so you have an agreement to increase labor standards, but you know what? There was no government involved. It was all done between private parties. That's an emerging phenomenon, and that increases the reputational risk for companies as well, because they basically have to now respond to areas of their business in a way that they didn't have to do it before.
That's very interesting. I mean, even I know some particular retail companies that have decided to pull out of Bangladesh because of the reputation of being there is bad. Yeah. They had never had a problem, but the fact that they're there, they're starting to move operations somewhere else.
Absolutely right. So Disney was one that cut their ties there, and you're absolutely right, especially if you're a retailer, because you have so many products, right? You're basically now carrying the reputational risk for a whole bunch of products, even if you're not directly responsible for that, right? You may be buying it from a supplier or supplier, but what companies are learning the hard way is that you can outsource operational and financial risk, but you cannot really outsource reputational risk, especially if you're a well-known brand and you are operating in a global context.
You talk a little bit in this area around one of the troubles that organizations have is the C-suite live in this very rich, positive feedback environment. So yes, they really potentially believe they have more leeway with the brand and with the reputation with people. How do you approach a CEO? You're a risk manager, again, let's just use retail, billion-dollar organization, and you've got to approach her or him and say something against the positive, a negative, feedback. How do you approach that?
So here's the problem, right? Let's say you're a retailer. Let's use your example, right? And let's say a retailer wants to make an investment decision, a capital allocation decision. Let's say they want to think about, should we enter the Italian market, just to take an example. In the executive committee, there will be, assuming the company is well run, okay, let's assume that. If the company is well run, there will be a robust dialogue on the pros and cons of making that decision. People will have different views on that. The CFO and the person who runs that business line will be at odds. They have a debate. Great. At the end of the day, they'll make a decision. They'll move forward. But the advantage of this candid dialogue is that many of the potential risks have been on the table, have been investigated, have been examined, and now have been driving and governing that decision-making process. Now let's take another issue where, let's say you are on the retail side, you're going somewhere, and now it's an issue that is driven upon you. Let's say an animal rights issue. Okay, is that there's an animal rights group that is concerned with the type of chicken that you're selling in your store. Now you see, there's nobody in the executive committee now that is representing that position, because they all think, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but most of them will think that these concerns are unwarranted, misinformed, or frankly extremist. So there's nobody in the room now that is actually representing this point of view, right? But there is enough, if this really becomes an issue, there will be enough support among the public or the customers that this have an impact on their business processes. So the difficulty is that you have these external concerns that are not represented in the decision-making room, and then you tend to make decisions that do not incorporate them or not aware of them. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. That's a different question. But you have to take them as a serious dimension or constraint in your business environment, because it really doesn't matter whether you agree with, let's say, a Greenpeace or Rainforest Action Network. They will make your life difficult. And if the good ones know that what they have to do, the strategies, campaigns resonate with a sufficient segment of the public, and then you have to deal with it. So a good way for companies to think about this is to think about, let's say, an advocacy group, let's say a Greenpeace, that they are just as much part of their environment as a competitor. So for McDonald's, Greenpeace is as much part of their environment as Burger King. And that's how you have to think about it. That's how you have to address it. And then you're moving from an emotional reaction of defensiveness or surprise, where you can look at it more from a clinical point of view. What's the issue? What do we do? What are our solutions, and so forth?
Oh, that's great. That's great. I mean, get representation, and you have to really present the business case so you can overcome some of that positive illusion, ecocentric thinking. One question we always get is, how do you measure quantitatively reputation?
So there are ways to do that. There are operational measures, and it's an important thing to try to connect with those. There is so I would distinguish financial and operational measures, right? So let's say you're a bank, right? And customer trust is an important thing, or customer satisfaction is an important thing. You can see how these types of measures correlate with reputational events. It's more difficult to connect them directly with financial impact. So we do know that they can have substantial impact on that reputational crisis can have a substantial impact on the market cap of a company, the overall shareholder value associated with a company. The smaller aspects, so like smaller trends up and down, are much more difficult to assess, and it's just because there's a lot more noise, right? Then we have these big events. So my sense would be, when I work with companies, don't over obsess on these kind of financial connections. Ask yourself, what's the core driver of the business, right? What's really driving your business success, and what are the reputational risks that can undermine that? So to give you an example, let's say you're Apple, right? And you have these concerns that they had over the working conditions at Foxconn, a Chinese manufacturer, right? Now, you can look at this case and you can say, well, I'm not really seeing an impact on sales in the United States, okay? You see, to me, that's silly, because there are so many things that drive sales of Apple phones, right? What's when did the last product come out? What was the hype? What were their competitors doing? You can't really look at that. But what you want to look at, I think, if you're Apple, which is, I think, what was going on in the back of their mind, is they're asking themselves, what's the source of success for us as a company? And the answer is that people love our product. That's what it is. They have a really strong emotional connection with our product, right? We're building great progress and people love them. They're really an essential part of their lives. And then you ask yourselves, when I look at my iPhone, I want to think that I can use. What do I want to think about? This was probably stitched together by 15-year-olds that's thinking about committing suicide. What do I want? Pretty easy answer, right? So you don't want to lose the emotional connection that your brand has. That's a much better way to think about it, to connect it with, what are the core business issues, rather than looking at the short-term fluctuation with the stock price, because it's just overdetermined. There's so much other stuff that's going on.
I like that idea. I mean, a brand, at the end of the day, like you said, a brand is a promise. I mean, it's very difficult to quantify a brand. I mean,
Exactly.
financially, CPAs
Exactly.
have difficult doing it.